The United States and China have never been overt enemies at any time between World War II and 2021, when Joe Biden initiated current hostilities, the breakdown of the strategic relationship. Hot take, all right? Within that span of time, believe it or not, the Chinese army and the American army directly fired bullets at one another in what we now call the Korean War. I don't know why we can't call it the Korean Civil War, but the war that created the division between North Korea and South Korea. All right? They fired live ammunition at one another. Nevertheless, they were not enemies. The generation of political and military leaders in China, still very much alive at that time during the Korean War, they were veterans of World War II, what they call the Sino-Japanese War. And they carried with them the memory of the military assistance, financial assistance, and cooperation provided by the Americans to the Chinese communists. They have memories stretching from the east coast of China all the way to Yunnan, all right? And that sense of gratitude, connection, and collaboration, it ran deep. When did the overt military alliance between the United States and China begin? What am I referring to? What most people remember as the Nixon-Kissinger Pact. I guess that's what people call it, in as much as anyone ever talks about this. I have a real question for you. If we did a poll, how many Americans are even aware that President Nixon met Mao Zedong and formed a military alliance with him? Like that very basic fact. It's one of the most important things to know about the history of the 20th century that is still influential, it's still crucially important now in the 21st century. It began in 1971. And the flashpoint, the conflict at that time, was not Vietnam, was not Cambodia, was not the division between North and South Korea. It is a surreal fact that the conflict that drew China and the United States to work together was in India. It was the war in 1971 between India and Pakistan. A war that directly impacted the lives of more than 100 million people. All right, really it could be about 200 million people. When I say directly impacted the lives, I mean they were physically there. They were in areas where bullets were being fired, bombs were being dropped. It was a brief war, the 1971 war, okay? But it was not a counterterrorism operation, all right? It was not a police action of the military. It was a war that involved all three branches of the formal military units of like 6 different countries. 3 branches, meaning the Air Force was involved. There were airplanes dropping bombs. The Navy was involved. There were naval battles, and the land armies of India and Pakistan were involved. Russia, the Soviet Union, sent naval vessels to fight on the same side as India against Pakistan. This was something of much greater symbolic value than it was strategic value. Now look, I'm 42 years old. I feel I have a balanced and mature view of Richard Nixon. I don't regard him as a vampire. I don't regard him as a psychopath. I don't regard him as insane. And I can actually tell you about some things Nixon did that were uniquely morally positive. Look into his record with First Nations people, Indigenous Americans. Good luck finding any other president in the history of the United States who even cared. Okay, and he cared. He really tried to get positively involved as their languages were going extinct and to question the whole history of what America had done to its indigenous peoples and what America ought to do next. Nixon cared. Nixon really tried to make a difference. However, Nixon was an alcoholic. He was not terribly intelligent. He was not very well educated, especially not about places like India and Pakistan. Nixon very fundamentally misjudged the situation. He believed profoundly that India was now in a pro-communist alliance with the Soviet Union, with Russia, that India was now going to carry the flag of communism, and specifically Russian-aligned communism, throughout the third world. That India was going to be this, today the population is 1 billion. At that time, I don't know. this nation of 800 million or whatever it was, backing and expanding the Soviet front throughout Africa, throughout Southeast Asia, that worldwide this was a massive domino that had just fallen in Russia's favor. And that was not true at all. Fundamentally, in 1971, India was committed to parliamentary democracy. And they still are in 2021. They were committed to parliamentary democracy, and they needed someone to sell them aircraft and tanks. And they got into the bed with the Russians to do that because the British weren't going to do it. They weren't going to be armed by the British. The Germans at that time weren't going to do it. Talking about West Germany, they're not going to do it. The French weren't going to do it. And the United States of America, at least under Nixon, wasn't going to do it. They needed the military hardware. And to a very limited extent, they got into bed with the Russians. Now, it's easy to misjudge that. Mao Zedong, now, I can't make the kind of balanced statement about Mao Zedong that I made about Nixon, right? At best, Mao Zedong was a very childish, very shallow man. I still don't feel I've come to a definitive answer. Like, I don't feel I've answered the question to my own satisfaction of how crazy Mao was. I've seen a lot of contradictory evidence. Even looking at the guy's handwriting, if you've seen handwritten statements in Chinese from Mao, there's sometimes when I see his handwriting and I think this guy was completely insane. He was a madman. But there have been other times when I saw his writing, he looks perfectly rational and control. And I think, well, you see how misleading these things can be. You look at one snippet of a man's life out of context. Okay. Mao Zedong was intensely jealous of the aircraft that Russia had provided to India. Whether or not it is a real fact that Mao had been asking Russia for these aircrafts. These are these really sexy looking, what am I going to say? Really fancy looking jet fighters of that era, fighter bombers produced by the Soviet Union. In reality, history has shown they are really not very effective aircraft compared to what the Americans could offer. But they look very impressive on the runway. This beautiful, sleek, modern geometric design. So this is what's remembered as the MiG series of aircraft, MiG. So MiG-17, MiG-21 fighter bombers. Okay? Whether or not Mao Zedong felt he had been competing for Russia to provide these aircraft. Okay? Mao's perspective on the Korean War, or the Korean Civil War, is that the Chinese army committed a huge number of men to Korea. And they lost and they died because they didn't have the Russian Air Force backing them. Because Russia didn't commit the aircraft to make it happen for the communist side in Korea. Okay? Now he's partly correct. And by the way, it's not the case that there were 0 Russian aircraft involved in the Korean War. But that's not a completely insane perspective on the history of the Korean War. Very briefly, Mao committed an enormous number of men, Chinese men, to fight on the North Korean side, and he thought he would win by overwhelming numbers. That's not the way it works in the 20th century. And the more men you have, the more mouths you have to feed. And a lot of those men starved. The most common anecdote to hear from the Chinese side about what it was like fighting in the Korean War was that they ate toothpaste. They ended up eating the toothpaste they brought with them to brush their teeth. They ate cats, they ate dogs. That starvation was a problem. So he deployed a huge number of men. The American side didn't have a huge number of men. They had some really good pilots. They had some really good aircraft. And yeah, it was a bloodbath. It was an unbelievably terrible, brutal war that today, outside of Korea, nobody remembers. And today, 2021, I think fewer and fewer people in Korea even, really remember what happened, okay? So yeah, apart from the aesthetics or the symbolic value of having support from the Russian side in terms of receiving these aircraft, that China should be receiving these aircraft, not India, not their enemy, India, to put a little bit of emphasis on it, because Mao felt, correctly or incorrectly, that India was his rival and was his enemy already at this early stage. In case you didn't know, Mao Zedong's eldest son, and he had another son who was mentally handicapped, but his eldest son, who many people presume would have inherited political power, would have become an important person in Chinese politics, and was, his good son, his important son, who was groomed for leadership and so on. His elder son died in the Korean War, in the North versus South Korean War. And it is plausible that he blamed the situation with military aircraft for his son's own death. Okay? Hot take. What would have happened in the Vietnam War if the Russians had committed aircraft? Okay? The whole history, when people get so used to this, they forget how weird it is. The whole history of what happened in Vietnam, the whole history of what happened in Laos, the whole history of what happened in Cambodia, the Americans keep sending these aircraft and doing saturation bombing. They're not having dogfights. There aren't MiG Russian fighters dogfighting with them. Sorry, that's a slang term in English for it. Since World War I, we've said dogfight. There aren't aircraft from the other side fighting back and preventing them, right? The Americans have bombers and they have helicopters that just have unchallenged free reign over the skies of Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. Why? Because the Russians didn't commit aircraft on the other side. Not my opinion. This is not my interpretation of what happened in the Vietnam War. However, this was a perspective, and I believe it was one of the most important aspects of Mao Zedong's perspective on what happened and what went wrong in the, what really was World War III in Vietnam. Because it wasn't just the Vietnam War. It was the Vietnamese, American, Chinese, Russian war. I mean, the Russians were crucially involved, and anyone could step back and say, well, the Russians, they had an embassy. The Russians did very little, and that's why the history of that unfolding was possible at all. If the Russians had put their foot down from the very start and said no, if they deployed the aircraft, if they deployed the men, right, none of this could have happened. And, obviously, a really big contrast here is the Cuban Missile Crisis. Why didn't the Americans do in Cuba what they did in Vietnam? Because they couldn't. The Russians drew a line and said no. The Russians would not allow the Americans to conquer Cuba or even just kind of mess around militarily. Right? Thus, the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, someone in Mao Zedong's position would be sensitive to that. Like, oh, okay, I see how it is. So, Cuban lives matter, but Vietnamese lives don't matter. Right? So, why don't Korean lives matter? Why don't Chinese lives matter? And now you come to find out, you're this crazy dictator, Mao Zedong, and you come to find out the Russians are giving aircraft to the Indians. That Russia is going to support your enemy and your rival, India, in precisely the way they didn't support you. And why? For reasons that from a Chinese perspective make no sense or don't matter. Russia is arming India. Russia is signing a special friendship and cooperation agreement with India so that India can fight a war to partition Pakistan into two different countries instead of being one country. Now, from a Chinese perspective, that just doesn't make sense. Okay? This is my hypothesis. Mao Zedong was furious. And the beginning of the American-Chinese strategic alliance that sentimentally began in World War II. Sure, the memory of Americans and Chinese fighting together against the Japanese, and a kind of special friendship and connection that endured. It endured for Mao personally and for the whole elite of the Communist Party and the military there. That endured despite the Korean War experience, okay? In 1971, the Chinese and the Americans find themselves on the same side against India. And that was a fundamentally irrational, ridiculous alliance that continued from 1971 to 2021. Any 10-year-old kid, you explain politics to, you sit down with a 10-year-old and explain what the situation was on planet Earth back when Bill Clinton was president of the United States. You'd be like, well, yeah, there's this evil communist dictatorship called China, but America's on their side, and they're friends. Oh, and India, they're a democracy. They have freedom of speech. They have a parliament. They have elections. They have newspapers. They're allowed to criticize the government. Oh, yeah. India, they're good in Elizabeth. But they're our enemies. America is instead in an alliance with China and Pakistan. Why Pakistan? Because Pakistan's an enemy of India. Oh, yeah. And there's this other country, Russia. They used to be a communist dictatorship, but now they're not. I mean, when we're talking about the Bill Clinton era, that's all over. They're now a democracy too. Whether or not you had optimism back at that time about how democratic Russia would be. But they're still our enemies because we're allied with China. That's that's this top priority for the United States of America all the way from 1971 to 2021. It was a fundamentally irrational, stupid decision made by one moron, one alcoholic, by Nixon, the same guy who bungled the Vietnam War so badly and bungled Cambodia and bungled Laos, did so many other terrible things at a cost of hundreds of thousands of lives. I don't want to estimate how many dead bodies really we can attribute to Nixon. That interesting topic for another video. How many deaths can we blame Nixon for? Maybe it's only tens of thousands. I should watch my words. But in any case, this guy made this one bad decision that has had so many long-term consequences. Now, if you were explaining the world to a 10-year-old when Bill Clinton was in power, the 10-year-old might say back to you, that's stupid. That doesn't make any sense. Why isn't America part of a pro-democracy alliance where they are fundamentally allied with Japan and India against China? Wouldn't that make more sense? And it was not until the year 2021 when Joe Biden asked that question, came up with a new answer. And now, the whole world is going to change. How bad is it going to get? What are the Chinese willing to do in terms of infiltration, information warfare, sabotage, espionage, including industrial espionage, industrial sabotage, unfair economic competition, in terms of what their Navy is going to do, what their Air Force is going to do? How about state-sponsored terrorism? What are the Chinese capable of? What are they willing to do if America is their overt enemy? The answer is we don't know. Because since World War II, despite the vicissitudes of foreign policy that have come and gone, since World War II, there has never been a period of time when China and the United States were overt enemies, when they were not, to some extent, on the same side.